want to talk this morning about the economy, but not about the economic outlook for the next year or two, although that's important enough and we know what the challenge is. I want to talk about the bigger challenge, which is not what the economy is going to do in the next year or two, but what the economy is going to do in the next decade or two, and the challenges we face on that front.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jerry Baliles, director of the Miller Center. In his recent State of the Union address, President Obama said, as he has said often in recent months, that the defining issue of our time is how best to sustain the American economy in the face of the current economic crisis. Indeed, this topic has been the subject of much of the Miller Center's own work over the last year, including our recent Kaplan Conference on the World Economy in Washington, and it has been the topic of many of our forums engaged colloquia. In the State of the Union, the President laid out his blueprint for growth based on fairness, manufacturing and job creation, education, advances in innovation and basic research, energy and tax reform, and the consolidation of several federal agencies. And he highlighted the successes of his economic agenda thus far. But Governor Mitch Daniels of Indiana, in the Republican response, countered that the actions of the White House have only held back the economy, citing rising unemployment, increased spending, and a growing national debt. Governor Daniels argued that though the president was elected on the promise of remedying the nation's fiscal woes, he cannot claim that the last few years have made anything but worse. While the successes and failures of legislation like the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act can only be measured in the fullness of time, we can agree that on the issue of the state of the U.S. economy, no challenge is more urgent, no debate is more important, and what is less clear, however, is the way forward from here. So we turn to today's forum guest with the hope and the expectation that he can shed some much-needed light on this issue. A member of the Miller Center's own governing council, Alan Murray is the deputy managing editor and online executive editor for the Wall Street Journal. He has editorial responsibility for all of the journal's websites, as well as their books, conferences, and television operations. Alan previously served as assistant managing editor of the Journal and author of the paper's business column. He was also CNBC's Washington, D.C. bureau chief and co-host of Capitol Report with Alan Murray and Gloria Borgia. While at CNBC, he wrote the Wall Street Journal's weekly political Capital column. He joined the Journal in 1983 and spent a decade in Washington as its bureau chief. During his tenure as chief, the Washington Bureau won 3 Pulitzer Prizes, as well as many other awards. Alan began his journalism career in June 1977 as the business and economics editor of the Chattanooga Times in Tennessee. He joined the Congressional Quarterly in Washington as a reporter in June 1980 and became a reporter the following year as the Japan Economic Journal in Tokyo on a loose fellowship. Alan is also the author of 3 best-selling books: Revolt in the Boardroom, The New Rules of Power in Corporate America. Another book, The Wealth of Choices, How the New Economy Puts Power in Your Hands and Money in Your Pocket. And my favorite, Showdown at Gucci Gulch, Lawmakers, Lobbyists, and the Unlikely Triumph of Tax Reform, which he co-authored with Jeffrey Birnbaum. Gucci Gulch received the American Political Science Association's McCary Williams Award. Alan has also received 2 Overseas Press Awards for his writings on Asia, as well as a Gerald Loeb Award and a Jan Hancock Award for his coverage of the Federal Reserve. In addition to serving on the Miller Center's Governing Council, he is a member of the Gridiron Club, the Economic Club of New York, and the Council on Foreign Relations. He has served on the Board of Visitors of the University of North Carolina. It's my pleasure to welcome back to the Miller Center this veteran journalist and good friend. Please join me in welcoming Alan Murray to the podium.
Thank you, Governor, and thank all of you for turning out today. I see a lot of familiar faces in the group. Charlottesville is something of a second home for me, which is not an easy thing for a graduate of the University of North Carolina to say. I want to talk this morning about the economy, but not about the economic outlook for the next year or two, although that's important enough and we know what the challenge is to get the unemployment rate down. And by the way, on that front, the news this morning is pretty good. 250,000 jobs created last month. The unemployment rate dropped from 8.5 to 8.3%. So at least things are headed in the right direction. But I want to talk about the bigger challenge, which is not what the economy is going to do in the next year or two, but what the economy is going to do in the next decade or two, and the challenges we face on that front. I spent last week at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, which is something I've been doing on and off for about 20 years, and it's a somewhat bizarre experience. It's a little, if any of you have ever been there, it's a pretty small Swiss ski village. Before that, it was a sanatorium made famous by Thomas Mann in his book Magic Mountain, a place where people went to cure whatever ailed them. And I guess in some sense, that's what happens at the World Economic Forum as well. And you see this strange combination of global political leaders and global business leaders and heads of NGOs and cultural figures. And so you'll walk into a room and see Angela Merkel talking to Mick Jagger and trying to figure out where this is all going. And I'm not sure anything really comes of it at the end of the day, but for a journalist, it's a great place to go and spend 4 days in constant earnest conversation from 8 o'clock in the morning till 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock or sometimes 3 o'clock the next morning, and get some sense of how this particular group of people, which I think to use the language of Occupy Wall Street, you could only describe as the one percenters, but you get some sense of what the one percenters are thinking. We do a dinner on Friday night every year that I moderate that has about 40 people sitting around the table, an off-the-record dinner, but an extraordinary combination of people. This year, around the table were the CEO of WPP, the big advertising firm, the CEO of Barclays Bank, the CEO of Rio Tinto, the big global mining firm, the CEO of eBay, the CEO of, or the chairman of Hewlett Packard. I did a kind of a quick back of the envelope calculation before I went into the room, and the total sales of the companies whose CEOs were represented in that room came to over $900 billion last year. So it's pretty remarkable. We also had the president of Harvard, the president of Yale, we had the former prime minister of Australia, and the former head of the European Central Bank, Jean-Claude Trichet. So I don't think there's any other event in the world where you can put together a group of people like that and get them to engage together in a table conversation. And what I usually ask them is, you know, what have you learned in your 4 days at Davos? Don't tell me what you came here to tell everyone else, but tell me what you picked up since you actually got here. And it's always an interesting conversation. But I was struck this year, for the first time, by how little discussion there was of the United States, anything about the United States. Now, some of that was good. There was a great deal of discussion about Europe, and you wouldn't envy that discussion at all. A focus on the debt crisis and the problems that it's causing. Europe is clearly headed for a period of recession, and not being the center of that discussion is a good thing. But, you know, it made me realize the degree to which the United States has been the center of global economic activity, certainly since the post-war period, and how quickly that sense is changing among the world's elite. And it's not that the rise of China or the rise of India hasn't been going on for a long time. It has. But I think if you look at the last 3 decades, the economy was driven by American consumers. American consumers who were spending more than they had and using their houses as ATM machines in order to maintain that spending, and that in turn enabled China, India, and the other countries, the other tigers, to enjoy strong growth. But those days are over. The American consumer is tapped out, and the extraordinary thing is that China is still growing, not at a 9% rate, but an 8% rate. India is still growing, not at an 8% rate, but a 7% rate. There is still great dynamism in the global economy out there. It's just that for the first time in my lifetime, we aren't at the center of it. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, clearly coming out of World War II, there was something badly imbalanced in a world economy where almost half of global production was done in this country. A mismatch that couldn't be sustained and shouldn't be sustained, right? And one of the great things of the last 3 decades is what has happened in China, the greatest alleviation of poverty in human history. So I don't think there's any reason to be chagrined about what's happened in the rest of the world, and the fact that the U.S. role in the world economy isn't the dominant role that it has been for the last 5 or 6 decades. But it does mean that the U.S. role in the global economy has to change. It has to change pretty dramatically. We are at a moment of time when a big shift in how we interact with the rest of the world is going on. And that's both a challenge and an opportunity. And for us as a nation to take full advantage of that challenge and that opportunity, we need strong political leadership. And unfortunately, it is happening at a moment when our political system seems to have failed us utterly. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. I mean, you go back to what happened last August. Standard & Poor's rating agency made it very clear that they were going to downgrade U.S. debt if the government didn't come up with a credible plan, not immediately, but over the long term, to get the deficit under control. Very straightforward about it. They would tell anyone who asked. It was not a big surprise. Everybody knew what had to happen. And the leaders of our government, and by the way, it's not that difficult. This is not Greece. Greece has a real problem. Greece doesn't have the resources to pay their debts. And they can't get those resources from their people, probably without causing an unacceptable degree of social unrest. What we were talking about last August was something on a much more manageable scale. 10 years worth of $4 trillion worth of deficit reduction over 10 years. Not a hard thing for the American economy to pull off. A number of different ways to get there. Really wasn't that difficult a challenge. So you had a clear warning from S&P. Come up with a plan. You don't have to do it tomorrow. Just show us that you have the ability as a political system to come up with a reasonable plan to get this problem under control in the long run, and we will let you maintain your AAA rating, which you have had since ratings began. And the system couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. They couldn't come up with an agreement that enabled that to happen, and as a result, S&P downgraded the debt. The whole thing got kicked off into November. November was a second opportunity, and again, the system failed. The political system let us down. Now, as somebody who spent my whole career or most of my career in Washington, I know a lot of people have become very cynical about government, and they tend to say, oh, that's business as usual. Of course, the government let us down. Big deal. That's the way it always works. That's not the way it's always worked. That was exactly the sort of challenge that you expected our political leaders to be able to come together and sit down in a room and say, okay, you know what? We got to put all the bickering aside here. We have a challenge to face. It's important for the country that we figure out how to do it. It's not that hard to do. Let's come up with a plan and let's pass it. And so there's something very different going on in the country right now that has caused that kind of failure. So let me just take a couple of steps back and talk about what it is that I think has to happen. And it's not just what I think has to happen. I mean, the interesting thing to me about this is that the way forward, the kinds of steps that need to be taken to deal with the economic challenge we face over the next 10 and 20 years are pretty easy to identify, not particularly partisan. It's not very hard if you get reasonable people in a room to have a conversation. It's not that hard to get agreement on it. And the crux of the problem is this. As I've already said, we spent 3 decades supporting the global economy by consuming more than we could afford as a people. And we were able to do that in some significant degree because the U.S. dollar was the world's reserve currency. And that meant that other countries wanted to hold more and more dollars, and so we didn't have to export as much as we imported. We could import and ship out dollars in return, and the Central Bank of China was perfectly happy to sit on those dollars because that was the way it held reserves for the future. So we were allowed to import without exporting and accumulated large deficits. Those days are pretty much over. It's clear that China, Russia, OPEC, everyone is looking for alternatives to the dollar, in part because they're not confident that the dollar will have the same significance 10, 20 years down the road that it had for the last 10 or 20 years. So they're trying to diversify their reserves. I mean, we benefit from the fact that there are not a lot of good alternatives out there at the moment. The euro's not going to be where they put their money, and there are not enough Swiss francs to fill everyone's reserves. But nevertheless, there's clearly an effort going on to diversify reserves, and it's pretty obvious that over the next 10 years, the next 10 years will not be a repeat of the last 10 years, that people will not continue to accept our dollars. And that simply means that we have to learn to export enough to cover what we want to import and some more to begin to pay down the debts that we've accumulated over the previous 30 years. So the U.S. economy has to move into more of an exporting mode in order to survive the transition and thrive during the transition of the next 20, 30 years. The only other alternative is austerity, to just cut way back on imports. And that's an unpleasant alternative. So, all right, so what has to happen to prepare the U.S. economy to export into this new world? Well, in August, when the debt crisis broke, I went to the members of our CEO Council. We have about 100 big companies, and I sent that meet once a year in Washington. And I sent them an email, and I said, look, it's clear there is a need for an economic growth plan. Give me some bullet points on what you would put in it. And of those 100 CEOs, I got about 35, 40 responses, and pretty much unanimity on what the agenda needed to be. And by the way, if I showed you those responses, they don't look that different from what President Obama said last week in his State of the Union address. That's why I say the agenda is not particularly controversial. I had an opportunity at the World Business Forum in New York to spend an hour on stage with Martin Feldstein, who was Ronald Reagan's economic advisor, and Bob Rubin, who was Bill Clinton's Secretary of the Treasury. And over the course of an hour conversation, we were talking about just this subject: what has to happen to the American economy to make that transition of the next 20 years? And over the course of an hour, I got them to agree on about 95% of the agenda. It is not a highly partisan or highly disputed agenda. What are the pieces of it? Well, first of all, corporate taxes. You heard the president talk about that. We have a corporate tax structure right now that many companies feel discourages them from investing in the United States. Now, the president in his speech last week was a little bit punitive in the way he talked about it. He said, he suggested we should raise taxes on companies that export jobs. When you talk to the CEOs, obviously they're much more clinical in the way they describe it. They say they have a job to do the duty of the to make money for the shareholders, and if the economics demand locating overseas instead of locating at home, that's what they'll do. But you can change those economics in part by what you do with the tax system. A lower nominal rate, you can probably pay for that in part by getting rid of some of the deductions that exist, and changing the treatment of overseas earnings, which right now discourages companies from bringing money back into the U.S. and investing it here. So there's a tax piece of it. There's a trade piece of it. If we're going to export more, we can't let this be the moment that we decide we're no longer going to support free trade in the world. The United States was the champion of free trade throughout the post-war period. You see some pulling back from that now. It's happening in both parties to some degree. Well, it's happening at exactly the wrong time, at the moment that we have to be able to export more. So there's a clear trade agenda. We need the Doha round. We need to continue the progress towards free trade. And as part of that, need to make sure that intellectual property is protected. Because our great advantage in the global economy is innovation, is ideas, is intellectual property. It comes in the form of software. It comes in the form of movies. It comes in the form of management ideas, all sorts of things that come out of the U.S. economy that are valued around the world, but we can't extract that value unless other companies are willing to honor trademarks, patents, copyrights, et cetera. And it's a particular problem in China, and it's a difficult problem in China, and there has to be. So any trade agenda has to come up with a smart way to address that, because we won't be able to export if the rest of the world feels they can just rip off our intellectual property at will. So there's an export agenda to it. There is an innovation agenda. Clearly, I spend a fair amount of time these days out in San Francisco, Silicon Valley. Clearly, we continue to be a center of innovation for the rest of the world, both in terms of our great universities and what they produce, but also in terms of places like Silicon Valley or Austin, Texas, or Northern Virginia, or Boston, Massachusetts, where there is a ferment, an intellectual ferment, an ability to come up with new ideas, an ability to get funding for those new ideas that doesn't exist anyplace else in the world. There is no country on the face of the earth that can match the accomplishments of a Steve Jobs, certainly, a man who transformed 6 different industries in his lifetime. But you look at Larry Page, Sergey Brin, Mark Zuckerberg, what's just happened in Facebook. You can make fun of a fortune that's built on the back of people playing games on Facebook, but I think it's a pretty revolutionary concept in the economy, and it was invented here. So we have enormous ability to innovate, and you need a set of policies that encourage that and promote that and take that forward. That gets into the next piece, because if you talk to any of those people, if you talk to Steve Jobs before he died, or if you sat down with Mark Zuckerberg or Larry Page or Sergey Brin, they would tell you the number one challenge is human resources. It's for them. It's not about the tax rate. It's not about wages. It's about where can we go to find the most talented engineers, and wherever those engineers are. Same with Larry Ellison at Oracle. Wherever those engineers are, they will go there. That brings up a couple of issues. One is immigration. I'm very fortunate to have one daughter at Yale University and one daughter at Stanford. And I'm sorry, Governor, I didn't send them to UVA or UNC. So but they both have classmates, very bright classmates, who as soon as they graduate from college are going to be shipped back to their home country, will not be allowed to stay, want to stay in this country and work, but will not be allowed because we have immigration policies that allow us to educate the world's best and brightest. And they want to be educated here, and they come here and they rush to our universities. And then as soon as they're done, we send them home, forcing Oracle and Apple and other companies to go back to India or to China to get the engineers they need to do their work. Nuts. It's absolutely crazy. And you won't find anybody, any intelligent person in either party who, in private conversation, won't agree with that statement. It's not a political statement. It's not a contestable statement. It's a fact. It doesn't make any sense if we want to have a strong economy going forward to not allow the world's best and the brightest to come here and work and be part of our innovative infrastructure. Now, there is an issue about, aren't they taking jobs away from Americans? Well, in fact, they aren't, because there aren't enough qualified Americans applying for those jobs, and that gets to the education system, which is another piece of the agenda. Clearly, you all have read the stories, seen the measures. Our ability to compete in the world on basic measures of science and math competency has declined over the last few years, needs to be addressed. Some of that is basic K through 12 education, and there's a lot going on in that area. One of the things I got to do last week was do a panel with Wendy Kopp, who started Teach for America. It's been around for 20 years now, and made a lot of interesting progress. And hearing her talking about the spread of charter schools and the progress that's been made in that area does make you optimistic. But our education system seems to, because it is so disparate, disaggregated, seems to have a difficult ability taking best practices and spreading them across the whole system. So progress in that area is very slow. But clearly, that's a big part of the agenda. So you can lay the pieces out, and you can pretty quickly see what the agenda is. Oh, and then I should say, obviously, dealing with the deficit. We have to get the federal deficit under control. That's part of what drives the international imbalances. If we have to borrow money from the world to fund government and to pay off our debts, that inhibits the adjustment that would allow us in the future to export more. So you have to get the deficit under control. And that's probably where the partisanship becomes greatest. But even there, it's not that difficult to figure out what to do. I mean, we're having a great national debate over whether the size of government 10 years down the road should be 19% of GDP, which is what the Republicans say, or 26, 27, 28% of GDP, which is sort of where you would be headed in a status quo world. And it's an important debate, significant debate. The stakes are high, but it's not a binary debate. I mean, it doesn't have to be either 18 or 27. It could be 23, 22. There is room for compromise. There is room for compromise. Could tax rates be a little higher on the most affluent Americans? Yeah, probably so. But could you offset that by saying, I live in Greenwich, Connecticut, and I look around at you laugh. I look around at the people who live around me and I say, wow. So the federal government is offering a mortgage tax deduction so that these hedge fund managers can build $30 million homes. Does that really make sense in a tax system? So could you come up with a tax system that cuts back some on the home mortgage deduction, or cuts back some on the high-end health care deduction that people use to do all sorts of plastic surgery that might not necessarily need to be subsidized by the government? So there's a way to deal with the tax issues. There's certainly a way to deal with the Medicare issues. The Paul Ryan idea of putting more of the power in the hands of consumers so that consumers can make intelligent choices about the way their tax dollars are spent. Really, it makes a lot of sense. Did he get the cap at exactly the right place? I don't know. But there's a conversation to be had there. So it's a solvable problem, but it does have to be solved. That's one piece of it. We have to figure out where the budget debate is going to settle. And so those are the pieces. They're not that controversial. There are little bits of controversy in them over things like the top tax rate, or you'll have controversy over immigration. And interestingly, the controversy over immigration isn't about what I was talking about, which is allowing the best and the brightest to come in and work for technology companies. It's how you link that to the more controversial part of the immigration problem, which is how do we protect our borders? How do we, stop the flow of illegal immigrants? And how do we deal with people who have clearly broken our laws in the course of entering this company? Again, it's not unsolvable, but difficult. So what you have is a pretty clear agenda, a pretty clear way forward, some areas that will require some compromise, but it is not that difficult for reasonable people to figure this out. And yet, for some reason, our political system doesn't seem to be able to get to an answer. Now, why is that? Well, I've spent an awful lot of time, because as I said, I spent most of my career, the governor went through probably at too great length, my resume. I spent most of my career in Washington. I feel like the 30 years I was in Washington, it was pretty much of a downhill slide in terms of the ability to get well-meaning people from either side of the party to sit in a room and do things that were in the national interest, but not necessarily in their political interest. And I watched many people do that over the years. I watched Bill Clinton do it on NAFTA. I watched Bob Dole do it on taxes. There's a whole set of people like Bill Bradley, Sam Nunn, Nancy Kassebaum, who who at least spent some portion of their time in Washington thinking about what's the right thing to do for the nation, as opposed to what's the right thing to do for the party or for my immediate reelection. And for whatever reasons, that seems to have declined pretty steadily over the course of the last 30 years. I happen to think part of it is redistricting, although there are political scientists who will, probably in this room, who will vehemently refute that idea. But I started my journalistic career covering the redistricting of 1980 and have watched this unfold over 3.5 decades. The combination of detailed demographic data, computers, and a series of Supreme Court decisions that basically said to the states, you can draw districts pretty much any way you want to draw them, as long as you make sure they're all equal in size, and as long as they don't disenfranchise protected minorities. And that has allowed for the creation of House districts that are political ghettos. And that in turn has led to in my view, the creation of a whole generation of politicians who have never had the experience of having to reach out to people of the other party. Because the only competitive contest they participate in is the primary contest. And once they win the primary, they're pretty much assured of re-election in their district. And so they go to Congress without any experience trying to speak to the vast middle, which is where the bulk of this country lies, or having any experience trying to deal with people across the aisle. And you see that in the conversation in Washington. There are a number of cultural things in Washington that have changed. I'm stunned today by how few members of Congress or the Senate are in Washington on weekends. They leave Thursday night, they come back Tuesday morning. And so none of the, people attack the kind of excessive coziness of Washington, but none of the interaction, the social interaction that took place that helped hold the place together happens much anymore. Tom Kean, who was the governor of New Jersey, grew up in Washington. His father was, I think, the ranking Republican on the Ways and Means Committee when Wilbur Mills was the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. And Tom Kean told me that he can remember on Sunday afternoons that Wilbur Mills would drive by the house and come in and have a cup of coffee with his dad, and they would talk about how they were going to deal with the problems they had to solve that week. Now, I can assure you that John Boehner never stops by Nancy Pelosi's house on a Sunday afternoon for a cup of coffee. It just doesn't happen. So it's a dramatically different place in that sense. Because I know someone will do this in the question and answer, I should bring up right now the media has something to do with this. Although my own view is it's not. People like to sort of blame the mainstream media. I feel what's happened is the mainstream media is a phrase that made some sense 3 decades ago. You had 3 big networks, you had a couple of newspapers, a couple of wire services. They spent too much time having lunch with each other, and so there was kind of a consensus media view. My observation is that does not exist anymore. The media is an incredibly diverse set of, when I watch my colleagues, because I'm now part of the Rupert Murdoch company, my colleagues on Fox News lament or talk about the mainstream media. I think, well, what are they talking about? This is the #1 cable news channel in the country. They're not the main. What is the mainstream media if they're not the mainstream media? You have Rush Limbaugh. And what that's meant is that people have been able to self-select. And I think it's a matter of consumer choice. It's not evil media executives imposing this on somebody. People have been able to self-select into a media world that reinforces their own biases. So you have people who live in a Fox News, Rush Limbaugh world, and you have people who live in a Huffington Post, NPR world, and there's no common thread. They don't even share facts. The fact set. It's like you're on different universes. So I do think media has had something to do with it, and I'm not sure what to do about it because, as I said, I think it's very much driven by consumer choice. The internet, by the way, empowers this as well. People, we're having to deal with the fact that fewer and fewer people come to us to see what our editors tell them is important, and they get their news from their friends, their Facebook feed, or a Twitter feed, or some other aggregator. And by the way, in a somewhat pernicious way, Google and Facebook are contributing this to these days too, as they introduce more personalization into the news that they provide you, the feeds that they provide you. They try to detect through algorithms what it is you like to read and give you more of that. So if you like to read Peggy Noonan, they're going to give you more columnists who think like Peggy Noonan. So you're less likely to encounter a great column or a fact or a news story that challenges your particular political view of the world. So I think that's part of it as well. When the president addressed this last week, and I've already said, I thought when the president went down through the agenda, he did a pretty good job saying, here's what has to happen to the economy. When he addressed the dysfunction in Washington, I actually thought that was kind of the weakest part of the speech myself. He didn't have much to say. In the end, he said we should end insider trading by members of Congress. As an editor for the paper that led the coverage exposing insider trading by members of Congress, I'm delighted to have him say that, but I don't think that's the problem. I don't think we have political dysfunction because members of Congress are doing insider trades on stocks. There are a lot of political scientists who will argue vehemently that money has a lot to do with it, and certainly the money politics connection has gotten obscene to the point of surrealism. If you watch what happened in Iowa, where Mitt Romney's super PAC was able to tear down Newt Gingrich while Romney said, I don't have anything to do with that. I have no connection. I'm not allowed to tell them what to do. I can't stop them. And they tore down Newt Gingrich. And then Newt Gingrich turned around and got $10 million from one man. $10 million from one man, Sheldon Adelson, to go back at Romney. So any principle of limited contributions from a single source, or any principle of transparency and accountability, we have to know where the money comes from and you have to take responsibility from it, is out the window. Huge amounts of money without transparency and without accountability. So the money system is clearly broken. So, and so the question is, and I'm going to wrap it up and take questions from you, but the question is, what is it going to take to turn this around? I was very optimistic the last election because I thought we have one guy, John McCain, who actually in his career has on repeated occasions reached across the aisle to reach sensible solutions. I'm not saying they were always the right solutions, but to reach sensible solutions with members of the other party. He did it on global warming, he did it on immigration, he did it on 2 or 3 other things that my memory will remember in just a minute. And then you had Barack Obama, who had no real experience to speak of, but had written 2 books on the desire to change the culture of Washington and bring people together. And so you thought, well, you have one person who wants to do it, and one person who's actually done it, and whoever wins, maybe they'll have a chance of making it happen. And it didn't happen. This is not an accurate portrayal, but my internal movie scene of how that happened was that Barack Obama tried for about 8 days the bipartisan approach, and then David Axelrod and Rahm Emanuel walked in his office and said, okay, that didn't work, let's move on now. We're going to try something else. So one of 2 things will have to happen to begin to turn this around. One is an act of great leadership, a leader who says, this is the biggest problem. The biggest problem we have is a dysfunctional political system, and I'm going to make it the top of my agenda and devote whatever political capital I have to fixing it. That's one way. Or the other way is that we will face a crisis that makes everyone wake up. And I don't know what that crisis is. Maybe it's some sort of a dollar currency crisis. Maybe it's some sort of a foreign policy crisis. Maybe it will be Iran. That's a pretty scary thing hanging out there. But something that makes the system say, you know what, we can't go on as we're going on. It obviously has to be greater than an S&P threat of a downgrade, but some kind of a crisis that makes the system say, you know, we've got to change course. In the end, I guess we're at a moment where you're seeing a rivalry between 2 competing views of history. There's one view of history that says this is a pattern. The rise and fall of great nations, we've seen it over and over again, and nations accumulate wealth, they become great, they calcify, and then they decline. And we're in some inexorable process as a decline as a result of that. The other view of history is American exceptionalism. Said, well, wait a minute, there's something different about this place. There's something different about the folks who landed at Plymouth Rock and at Jamestown. There's something different about the way our government was formed. There's something different about the pioneer experience and what happened on the frontier that gives us a unique ability to recreate ourselves every once in a while, to figure out what we need to do to make the kind of turn that we have to make in the next 2 decades. And so I'd like to end by saying I'm going to continue being hopeful that we can pull it off. I can't predict. I'm sure you'd like me to predict how it's going to happen. I don't know how it's going to happen, but by God, I'm hopeful that it will. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan, for a very illuminating and wide-ranging discussion. In a moment, we'll take questions from the audience. If you have questions, queue up in the back. Jeff Chittister will be there with a microphone. Make your questions relatively brief so that we'll have time for many questions. And let me, while the questions are being formed, let me pose an opening question, Alan. Okay. You've given us a choice between fiscal austerity and economic growth based on these items you've mentioned, corporate tax reform, innovation and research, free trade, human talent, immigration reform, education, deficit control. And you've made it very plain to us that this is a clear agenda that reasonable people could adopt it, could find consensus. So are you suggesting that there are people in Washington who are not reasonable?
No. No. Do you have another question?
There are those, though, who think that the external shock possibility and the fiscal austerity that's being imposed across Europe can be imported into the U.S., notwithstanding the recent bout of good news in the U.S., they think that this is actually going to impose fiscal austerity. So how optimistic are you that this export growth approach is really going to be the way out for us?
Well, it's a question of gradualism, right? I mean, yes, you do have to, American consumers do have to reduce debt. The American government does have to get its deficits under control. And what you hope is that you can do that in kind of a gradual, steady way, even as the export side of the economy is growing. And so over a period of, that's why I look at 10 years or 20 years instead of 1 year or 2 years. Over a period of 10 years, that's a doable transition without, again, it's not for Greece. Greece can't do it. They have a much tougher problem than we do. We could do that. That's doable. But I guess the question is, what's the likelihood that we will be allowed to do that, or that we'll continue to head in a direction that forces us to have a precipitous crisis that could end up being much more painful than that kind of gradual 10-year adjustment?
Let's go to the first question in the back.
Hello. My name is Jared Lake, and thank you for your speech. And I think a vast majority of Americans worry, as you do, about the future. My question is, what's the possibility or the impossibility of a third and fourth party rising up to center left, center right, that are not far right and not far left?
Well, I think the environment has never been better for that to happen. If you look at the opinion polls, the number of people who self-identify as independents and who express frustration with what's happening in both parties is bigger than it's ever been before. So there is an opportunity for somebody to do that. But we know from history it's a very difficult thing to do, and it's not clear to me the right person exists to do that. I know we got a call the other day from the mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, who was interested in doing a forum with us and with Simpson and Bowles, Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles, on the federal deficit. I don't know what that means, but it sort of suggests to me it's still floating around in his mind. You know, if this doesn't go well, should I jump in this summer as an independent candidate? Is he somebody who could rally the center of the nation around him? I think he's a pretty competent guy on some of the social issues that Americans care a lot about. I'm not sure he's completely in touch with the heartland. Is there somebody else who could do it? I don't know. I mean, God forbid it's Donald Trump. There's no, I don't see any Ross Perot's on the horizon. So anyway, the bottom line is the environment has never been better, but we need the person.
Yes, thank you for your address. I wonder if you would agree with me, or at least consider, that Obama was absolutely brilliant in bringing back Summers and Keichter and the crowd who let the thing happen, the crisis happen under their noses, under the old saying, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. I'm sure he learned a lot more about how and what happened by keeping them close.
Yeah.
And I won't tell you a long joke, but the last line of it is, they're going to do it until they do it right. So
Yeah.
I would like your view on that, since so many people criticize the fact that he brought them back.
Yeah, look, I don't. I think they did a pretty good job, actually, of keeping us from falling into crisis. But you make another. And by the way, I love I guess it was Winston Churchill who said that America will do the right thing, but only after it's tried everything else, which I've always thought was a pretty good description of the way things happen in this country. But your comment gets to another point, which is that the crisis of 2008 got a lot of people in this country really mad for good reason. I mean, here you had, and these are my Greenwich neighbors again, I don't want to pick on them, I have to live with them, but I mean, here you have this group of financiers who made really stupid decisions. I mean, who was it who decided that it was okay to lend 100% on a mortgage? And furthermore, to do it without documentation, you know, they called them liar loans. You don't really have to prove you have an income. And by the way, we're going to give you this low teaser rate, and we'll qualify you for the loan if you can pay the low teaser rate, even though we know you can't pay the rate that's going to hit you 2 years later. You know, when did that become a sensible way to do business? And then to get those crazy loans all wrapped up in packages and have the ratings agencies say these are AAA loans and have all the financial institutions buy gobs and gobs of them. Craziness went on. And then to have those same financiers get bailed out by the taxpayer made a lot of people mad. And it's totally understandable that they got mad, but it doesn't mean it was the wrong thing to do. The effects of a complete financial breakdown, which were a very real possibility in the wake of Lehman Brothers in 2008, would have been much greater on everybody sitting in this room than that was. Nevertheless, that's the economic effect. The political effect has been profound, I think. It has widened a gulf between not just finance and society, but business and society, that I think is very dangerous and damaging to the kind of agenda I was just talking about. There's, you know, Obama doesn't exist in a background. When he beats on business, you know, whether it's the big insurance companies or the big oil companies or the big banks, he's doing that because he knows that's what his constituents want to hear. And the fact that we have opened up this rift in American society is going to make it that much more difficult to come together on the kind of agenda that I was talking about earlier.
Mr. Murray, thank you for coming. I liked your agenda that you laid out, but I had a question for you regarding foreign policy and whether there is an aspect of foreign policy or controlling the military super complex that's kind of arisen in America that should be a part of that. I guess mainly my question is, Americans care a lot about the economy. They also seem to care about, for rightful reasons, terrorism and external threats to the United States, and are willing to put a lot of dollars towards that idea and towards protecting American security. So I guess my question is do you think that there is an aspect to foreign policy and the military in bringing America's economy back?
I think a strong foreign policy is really important, and I'd challenge your assumption just a little bit. And if you listen to it's traditionally been the Republicans who have stood for a strong military and a strong foreign policy. But if you listen to the 173 debates that we've had so far, it's hardly been mentioned. Now, some of that is, I think, because the key to a strong foreign policy going forward is a strong economy. Number one, foundation. That you cannot have one without the other. But I do think there's some pretty difficult decisions that are going to be made down the line about how do you deal with Iran and how much are we as a people willing to continue to devote to defense in order to assure a stable world.
Alan, before we get to the next question, we have a question from our Facebook page from Kyle Kottner in Washington, and the question is this: the unemployment rate is now down to 8.3%, but many sources state that there may be 3 million long-term unemployed who are currently not being counted. With questions of accuracy with this rate, how can the media clearly convey this information?
Well, I think we try and do it all the time. I mean, one of the things that happens at a period like this is you get discouraged workers who leave the workforce, they stop looking for jobs, and therefore they stop being counted as unemployed, because the unemployment rate counts people who are actively looking for jobs. And so you see the percentage of people employed go down, but the unemployment rate stays very low. What normally happens at about this time is those people start to go back into the workforce, and you can see the unemployment rate start to tick up again. Not because we aren't creating jobs, but because people who weren't looking for jobs start to look for them. Are we going to see that over the course of the next year? Yeah, I think we are. So I wouldn't expect to see 2 or 3 tenths of a percentage point decline in the unemployment rate every month from now until November. I would expect it to be a very slow decline, if at all, in part because of that dynamic.
Before I thank you, I'd like to thank Governor Belials and the Miller Center for having an opportunity for me to address you. I couldn't make it to Davos. And so it really is an honor to be able to address you and perhaps get more time than some of the guests that had huge, what'd you say, how many billions of dollars?
Yeah, it was over
sales.
$900 billion.
Well,
Yeah.
my wife and I had a garage sale, and I came out with about $1.50.
Okay, but hey, I'm
Thank you,
here
Governor.
too.
Thank you,
I'm here
Governor.
too.
Okay. But I have a more serious question, I think. I am not at all optimistic that the consensus that you think exists among the many people who showed up in Davos, including the leader of the Rolling Stones, because I think this same elite has been discredited by the situation we're in because they had a consensus before. Why should I have any faith in their consensus in light of what that consensus has brought us to today and that has really focused on Europe more because of the inability of governments there to try and counter our economic and financial...
I think that's a fair point. And I talked a minute ago about the split between business and society, but you put it in probably what is a better way. It's a split between the elites in society. Americans have always been pretty tolerant of their government and tolerant of the system because they thought the system was working pretty well and they were getting a reasonable deal out of it. And I think right now, for the first time in a while, that social compact has been broken, and you're going to see the effects of that in this next election. And it does. I mean, you can challenge whether my agenda is the right agenda, but it is part of what is making it difficult to get a consensus on an agenda.
The one question I have is, have you had a chance to look at Dennis Kucinich's proposal to change fractional reserve banking?
I'm vaguely familiar with it, but I haven't looked at it in any detail.
I'd like to ask you about one element of the political dysfunction and stalemate, which has been the kind of the extraordinary influence and inflexibility of the anti-tax zealots and its influence on the Republican Party. And I guess before you answer, I'd like to say that I think the Wall Street Journal is one of the few institutions in this country that actually is in a position to soften that influence if editorial policy so chose.
Well, so let me, first of all, I should have said this at the outset, make it very clear that at the Wall Street Journal we have the church and we have the state, and I'm part of the state, not part of the church. So my influence over the editorial policy of the Wall Street Journal is either insignificant or negative, depending on the temperament of the editors on any given day. So there's not much I can do about that. I don't disagree with you. I think the influence, and it's not hard to find conservative Republicans who will say, at least in private, probably not in public, that the influence of Grover Norquist in this debate has been pernicious. When 7 out of 7 Republican candidates stand up at debate number 327 or whatever debate it was, and when asked, would you accept a budget plan that had $9 of spending cuts for every $1 of tax increases, and 7 out of 7 raised their hands and said no, something is wrong. I mean, that ought to disqualify all 7 of them on the face of it, because how can you make a deal if you're not willing to deal? So yeah, I basically would agree with you.
By the way, thank you. It was shocking, to say the least.
Is that a good thing?
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
But you mentioned Standard & Poor. Is this company to be trusted or believed, considering the fact that it is the same company that announced, as Enron was sinking, that Enron is solid?
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. It was an irony in August that it was Standard & Poor's, of all agencies, that was being the arbiter of American fiscal responsibility. I mean, you do have to wonder why Standard & Poor's, why the ratings agencies have not gotten more of the blame. In some ways, of all the ridiculous things that happened in the run-up to 2008, the most ridiculous was continuing to give these securities that were backed by loans that were made with no documentation and had ridiculous teaser rates, and 100% of the value of the mortgage were rated AAA by Standard & Poor's. You know, how in the world did that happen? So no, I don't think Standard & Poor's has any special moral authority in the world. But it so happens that in August, they were making a reasonable point, that it would be nice for the United States to have a path, not an immediate drastic austerity, but a path towards deficit reduction over a 10-year period. And that if you don't have a path towards deficit reduction over a 10-year period, it's probably hard to continue to tell your bondholders that you deserve a AAA rating. So while I don't think Standard & Poor's has a particularly high moral standing in the world at the moment, I think the point they were making was totally reasonable, and the ramifications of the downgrade were fairly serious. Not in the sense that it caused an immediate increase in the cost of government debt. It didn't. There's so much money awash out there that it's still easy for the U.S. government to raise money. But it caused a significant decline in the credibility of the United States and accelerated the effort of China, OPEC, Russia, others who were trying to come up with alternatives to the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency, because they said we cannot responsibly continue to rely solely on this currency to be our reserve currency.
Take 2 more questions from the audience.
We heard an interesting talk by President Obama in his State of the Union message, and it had a lot of populist ideas in there which appeal to so many of the people of the United States. But how many of these are actually things that can be done or will be done?
Well, I think it's more rhetoric than reality. I sort of suggested that when I was talking about the corporate tax. What needs to happen, there's not a wide disagreement on what needs to happen with the corporate tax, but the president talked about it in a much more punitive way than Republicans will talk about it. So it's really more of a rhetorical difference than it is a substantive difference. To me, one of the great questions of the election of 2012 is this kind of populism going to work? I mean, we know throughout my lifetime, throughout the post-World War II period, that kind of populist appeal has not worked in the United States. And it hasn't worked because Americans are willing to tolerate inequality in the belief that they have a chance to win the lottery someday too. And the question for 2012 is, have we finally pushed that faith to the breaking point? I think that's one of the important issues of this election that will be tested by how those kinds of messages play.
Thanks for your talk. You ended on a note of optimism. You said you didn't know how it was going to work, but somehow something would come out okay, I think.
Maybe.
basically. In the beginning, you critiqued the President's State of the Union agenda for fixing the economy. And you commented that you thought the corporate tax, his ideas were a little punitive, so forth and so on. But specifically, you said that was because he was somehow going to reward corporations that created domestic jobs as opposed to doing their business overseas. Yeah. Now, considering that the per capita GDP of the U.S., and let's pick a country like China, is 8 or 10 times different, how would you, if you were president, actually create middle-class jobs in the United States? You talked about innovation and so forth. The U.S. is fantastic on that. But how would you take care of the great bulk of the middle class in keeping jobs in the U.S. in the 5 to 10-year future?
Well, I think, understand, as I said just a minute ago, I'm not criticizing the substance. I think there's agreement on the substance. The tax code ought to tilt towards people who create jobs in the United States. All I was saying was that the president presents it in a punitive way, suggesting that the people who, when they do the hard numbers and say, you know what, the only way I can make this work is if I move my factory overseas, that somehow they were evil in doing that, as opposed to doing exactly what they're supposed to do in their roles. So I think there ought to be incentives, that the tax system ought to be restructured in a way that at the margin encourages jobs in the United States. I think innovation is part of the answer. I think, I talk to folks like Larry Ellison or Bill Gates who say they would actively prefer to hire their engineers, the bulk of their engineers, in the United States. There's certain functions where you want to be as close to the market as possible. They prefer to hire here, but they can't get the people. So that suggests immigration, education. There's probably a big piece for, I didn't talk about it, but there's probably a big piece for community colleges. I mean, K through 12 education is a long-run proposition, but having a better partnership between business and community colleges to create the kind of jobs that, like the Volkswagen plant in Chattanooga needs to get going, is a possibility. It is not, at least everyone tells me I'm just a reporter, all right? But it is not impossible. It's not like there's some wage gap between us and the rest of the world that makes it impossible to conceive of jobs here. Look at Germany. Germany, at the moment, is an export powerhouse. Some of that has to do with the way the economy is structured. Some of it has to do with the benefits they get from being in the euro. But for whatever reason, they're doing it. Can't we be a little bit more like Germany? I think we can.
You know, when we bring Alan Murray back to the Miller Center, he brings engaging and informative views, and he's done so again today. Please join me in thanking Alan Murray.